questions concerning strategies of inquiry. And as Roland so smartly insisted, methodologies are group-specific and as such political. The appropriate methodology for any particular inquiry is a matter of contestation, as scholars working within different paradigms often disagree about the appropriate way to truth. Strategies that are accredited as legitimate means to acquire truth gain their force from decisions of particular human beings. Thus, there is a power element in the accreditation of knowledge. Power is never the only factor involved, but neither is it negligible. Probing the politics of knowledge, tracing how power circulates within particular accredited accounts of the world, has been central to my research. And it's an approach that involves disidentification from the guiding precepts of the two disciplines in which I was trained, philosophy and political science. Indeed, it requires repudiation of notions such as value neutrality, norms of distance, dispassionate research, and the quest for universal explanations. My path to this quest for truth is by way of philosophy of science, feminist theory, critical race theory, and more recently, post-colonial and decolonial theory. Rich bodies of thought that illuminate potent biases in accredited knowledge formations, particularly with respect to embodied power, to processes of racialization, gendering, and sexualization, which remain largely invisible within accredited paradigms in Anglo-American philosophy and political science. So I should start with a caveat. Adopting the kinds of methods I use is not going to catapult you to the top 10 citations in any of these two dominant fields. Yet it will equip you to grapple with the politics of knowledge production in ways that are completely at odds with relativism and with the post-truth inclinations of the alt-right. Feminist epistemologist Lorraine Code has defined knowledge as an intersubjective product constructed within communal practices of acknowledgement, correction, and critique. This definition has the virtue of emphasizing that knowledge is a human product, generated by fallible inquirers through processes of interrogation and contestation that involve many people over long periods of time. Her reference to practices of acknowledgement suggests plurality. There are multiple forms of knowledge. For example, perception, memory, intuition, introspection, recollection, recognition, conceptualization, contemplation, which cannot be reduced to a singular kind. And as human conventions, these epistemic practices have histories. They change over time. Epistemic practices also have standards internal to them that provide criteria for assessing quality. Thus, Code's definition makes it possible to understand that the criteria for judging recognition, whether of a person, a place, an object, or a pattern, might be different from criteria for assessing introspection, much less moral deliberation. Assessing the validity of knowledge claims, then, requires attention to specific ways of knowing that are situated within particular social, cultural, and historical practices, which afford determinate standards of evaluation. Academic disciplines make the world knowable through precise techniques for framing research questions, organizing and analyzing data, accrediting particular modes of explanation, and forms of argument. Training within a discipline involves learning to perceive the world through accredited categories and to study phenomena through routinized research procedures. Although specific research paradigms change over time, certain fundamental research heuristics persist, providing concepts, definitions, and hypotheses that guide research and generate a fundamental research heuristic that involves a shared set of assumptions so central to a mode of analysis that they quite literally cannot be jettisoned, and they typically are not even acknowledged. But that these heuristics are widely held does not mean that they're correct. They are and must be subject to contestation. As a social science that seeks to discern patterns in the political world that reveal more than statistical frequencies, political science encourages systematic observation and subsequent classification of observed phenomena on the basis of certain similarities and differences. Whether addressing observation or classification, political science is ensconced in a visual field, which makes transparency seem altogether appropriate as a fundamental research heuristic. Yet the very ubiquity of these visual metaphors should give us pause. Although entrenched in conceptions of science and popular governance since the 18th century, they incorporate fundamentally flawed notions about the nature of research, processes of scientific inquiry, human perception, and the politics of communities within research in the academy. Transparency talk, as it is currently circulating and has circulated since the time of Bacon, many centuries ago, distorts three fundamental aspects of knowledge production: the theoretical constitution of facticity, that perception is a social practice, and the politics of representation, aspects of knowledge production that lie at the heart of my work. So I want to take just a few minutes to talk about each of these three aspects of knowledge production, because they are so systematically distorted through much of the fact-value demarcation, insistence on that demarcation. So first, the theoretical constitution of facticity. In contrast to the assumption that facts are freestanding entities, that a neutral observer can faithfully record and accurately describe, research data are methodologically constituted, and as such are perceived and characterized differently by those working within different methodological frameworks. Although characterized as a unitary discipline, political science is polyglot, rife with theoretical traditions and research frameworks. Facts can be collected only after they have been designated as worthy of attention by theoretical presuppositions embedded within particular methodologies. Indeed, the noun experience, the verb to experience, and the adjective empirical are not univocable terms that can be transferred from one system to another without a change of meaning. Experience does not come labeled as empirical, nor does it come as self-certified. What we call experience depends on assumptions hidden beyond scrutiny, which define it and which in turn it supports. An attempt to identify an unmediated fact mistakes the conventional for the natural. And transparency talk masks the theoretical constitution of facticity and appeals to ill-conceived notions of objective evidence defined in terms of replicability, reproducible findings, and consistency of results. Perception as a social practice. In contrast to notions of neutral observation, tacit assumptions structure perception, making some things appear normal, natural, unquestionable, or given. Far from being neutral, perception is affected by what we know, what we believe, the languages we speak, the cultures we internalize. Perception is partial, both in the sense that it's incomplete and in the sense that it tends to things of interest to the viewer. We only see what we look at. But what we look at within political science is structured by tacit criteria of relevance and significance. Perception is context dependent, shaped by relations between things and by our own expectations and anticipations, which are theoretically informed. Perception is structured by social values and discipline-based methodological assumptions. When these assumptions are widely shared, they insulate beliefs from critical scrutiny. Thus, replication may demonstrate that a particular research method generates consistent results, but it cannot prove that the results are accurately depicting the object under study. Social and disciplinary norms governing perception are masked by the language of transparency. Whether informed by shared social knowledge or accredited disciplinary frames, the structuring power of tacit assumptions disappear in discussions of transparency logics, and totally miss the politics of representation. Definitions, concepts, measurements, involved in the production of a research object are never politically neutral. Sometimes subtly, sometimes blatantly, characterizations of observed phenomena are structured by power and accredit conventional hierarchies. So just to give you a little snippet of how this plays out, in 2011, the American Political Science Association published a report on political science in the 21st century, which showed brilliantly that race, gender, sexuality don't figure in political science, and actually tried to make sense of why race, sexuality, gender, embodiment are deemed to be not of interest. And those of us who do kind of feminist work, critical race work, knows that nobody reads our works. Kind of frustrating, but we know this to be true. And this report documented it, all the facts, all the figures are on it. So why is all of this omitted from the study of politics when power seems to be at the center of it? The report itself shows that political science thinks it only studies what is average, what is typical, what is the norm. That is, white men. So 25% of the adult population in some place like the United States, for instance, is allowed to masquerade as an unmarked norm. And if you're not reading any of the critical race or feminist scholarship, you're not engaging the contestation over that norm. So when critical race and feminist scholars argue that race is a political division, a system of governing people that classifies them into social hierarchies based on invented biological demarcations, the claim makes no sense to well-trained empirical investigators. When intersectional scholars argue that sex is not a dichotomous demarcation of the human species related to reproductive function, the claim seems nonsensical, incompatible with observable biological evidence. The very precepts of visibility seem to attest that race and sex are matters of physical embodiment corroborated by the eye. So to move beyond biologization of race and sex, you need a different kind of theoretical paradigm. And that kind of paradigm requires you to completely move away from the notion of the abstract universal. So tiny tips as I wrap up here. Refuse reportedly neutral and inclusive terms which appear to include precisely those who have been barred from political participation. Interrogate individualist discourses that mask group membership and practices of subordination. Constantly question the tendency to posit elite white men as the unmarked norm. Beware of methodological nationalism, which not only takes the nation as a fundamental unit of analysis, but naturalizes the nation as a purportedly racially homogeneous, bounded social group, replete with a culture of politics and economy. Naturalizing the nation as a people bound by blood, with long-established ties to a land, masks the fundamental nature of white settler colonial societies, which gain access to land through conquest and colonization, and renders invisible the arduous work of nation building, of forging one out of the many, along with the exclusions and exterminations that requires. Jettison the very concept of the abstract universal, which allows elite white men to masquerade as the unmarked norm, the instantiation of the universal, in which allows whites to appear to be raceless, as racial characteristics are attributed only to others, and white men appear to be unencumbered by gender, as women carry the burden of the sex. Abstract universalism is particularly pernicious because it supports the pervasive and persistent tendency to treat fields of gender and politics and race ethnicity and politics as content specializations of little interest to the discipline at large. And it legitimates the belief of mainstream scholars that they don't have to read, cite, or teach cutting-edge research that foregrounds the experiences of the majority of the human population. So abstract universalism locks us within a realm accredited by philosophy and political science that just obscures everything that Manu was talking about, the larger world in which we live.
thanks very much for inviting me. I'm sorry, I didn't let you introduce me. Sorry.
So, for those of you interested, Professor Hawksworth will be in 5414 after the break, so right in here. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Professor Melissa Wright. Professor Wright is a critical geographer whose work investigates the dynamics linking politics, economy, and culture in rapidly changing situations in northern Mexico and along its border with the United States. Her work currently focuses on the social movements that bring attention to connections binding incarcerations and forced disappearances within democratic regimes across the Americas, as well as the explosion of detained, disappeared populations across the global south and north. And she's from Penn State.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I jumped the gun. I was about 4 or 5 years ago, the political science department at Penn State declared it was no longer doing theory, and it did that made that declaration on the day that Wendy Brown came to give a talk. Yeah, so anyway, oh well. Well, I'm also the chair of the Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department, which I mention only because I think in the breakout section I can talk with you about how to write proposals as an interdisciplinary scholar, but also as a scholar who has a footing in a particular social science tradition. I've written a lot of proposals. Most of my research is funded by National Science Foundation or other kinds of grants. Most of my graduate students, all of my graduate students write proposals, and most of them do get funding from NSF or Fulbright. So I spend a lot of time writing proposals. I do a lot of reviewing for Social Science Research Council, NSF, and also some foundations. And so in the breakout section, I'm really happy to talk with you about how I write a proposal, how I approach it, how I advise, that kind of thing. But as the department head, I work with a lot of scholars also in the humanities, and especially junior faculty and our graduate students we've got a dual degree with 11 different departments, conflict, English, geography, political science, and so forth. And so I work a lot with students as they're developing proposals, and so I'd be happy to talk more specifically, very practically, about how I approach that project. I'm going to do something, though. I'm going to take advantage of all y'all here to present some ideas on a project that I have been working on for several years with several colleagues. It's an NSF-funded project, Social Science Humanities Research Council from Canada. Also, one of the collaborators is Juanita Sumberg, who's a geographer at the University of British Columbia. And the collaborator is Hector Padilla, who's at the Autonomous University of Ciudad Juarez, where I also have a long-standing affiliation. And we have a research team in northern Mexico at the UACJ, the university in Juarez, where we've been doing this work. And we've had a project of several years in which we were looking at the effects of militarization on both sides of the border. We're looking particularly at Juarez, El Paso. I've done my research for many years in the city of Juarez, which is across from El Paso, Texas, on the main border. And in the two Nogaleses, Nogales Sonora and Nogales, Arizona, which are connected. So in the course of this, we did a lot of focus groups, collective mapping things. The geographers came out here. Interviews and so forth. And one of the interviews that we conducted was with at the time, the police chief of Juarez, Julian Lezaola. And he's a very well-known figure in Mexico. He's very well-known as a police chief with very tough tactics. He's also known as someone who commits torture. And this was at a time, we interviewed him in 2012, something called a drug war has been going on in Mexico. It's an official war, but it's been officially declared to be a conflict. Funded, the Mexican government has gotten a lot of funds from the United States government, a lot of support from Canada, and a lot of armaments from Germany and Israel and England. So it's an international situation, and the idea of drug wars are not domestic affairs, certainly not in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, the story of the Americas is very much tied up with these concepts of drug wars. and the transition from a Cold War into a drug war period. And so my work is looking at some of that. So what I've got here are some reflections. I'm talking really fast because I want to actually jump into it. Some reflections about that interview. Okay, and they're loose, and I'm really want to just throw them out here, and then if there's anything that we want to talk about later, or you have any comments, or please, I'd love to hear them. Okay. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Lezaola had been the municipal chief of the Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua Police Department for 14 months when our research team interviewed him on May 7, 2012. He was one of many public officials we were interviewing that month in the border city as part of our multi-year project on militarization and la vida fronteriza, which means the border life, along the Mexico-U.S. border. Central to our investigation was understanding to what extent militarization had emerged as a salient concept in people's experience of their daily lives in quotidian landscapes along both sides of the international divide. Within critical geography and cognate fields, the topic of militarization has gained increasing attention as a harbinger of neoliberal governance, consolidated transnational capitalism, and of reconfigured territories in relation to international borders, securitization, and mobility. Mexico certainly provides rich material for such studies, as it has been a global leader in its embrace of neoliberal policies through the privatization of public assets and the slashing of state budgets, and its renewed arrangements with both the U.S. and Canadian governments for patrolling its northern border and for criminalizing the informal economy, including unregulated labor in what's called the drug economy, but that's not the informal economy, obviously. Many scholars have pointed to a militarization of the Mexico-U.S. border region on both sides as evidence of an entrenched neoliberal approach that indicates allied efforts among the three North American governments that prioritize the private sector and its interest over the public sector in its contract with each respective government. In our project, we explore how people who live in the border region perceive of militarization and how they understand its meaning for them in their daily lives and for their government. By militarization, we refer to the use of military tactics for containing a population and controlling a territory around the binary concepts of enemies and allies, and the usage of related military concepts such as war to refer to non-military situations, that is, civil society, public space. Rather than regard this concept of militarization as a steadfast definition in our project, we opened up its meaning in our interviews to discussion, and we asked to what extent the concept is useful for framing and presenting experiences of daily life in relation to urban governance along the border. In this way, in our fieldwork, we focused on how border residents perceive of militarization with regard to civilian branches of government, such as the civilian police forces and politically elected officials, and to what extent our informants view an integration of military concepts or military forces with public institutions. Now, this is important to say because, for example, El Paso, Texas has a huge military base. It's actually where most of the training for the Iraq and in our Middle Eastern wars takes place. So we're not looking at actually the military base. We're looking at militarization, because that by definition is militarized, right? So we're looking at militarization in other spaces. Such processes of militarization, as much critical geographic literature has shown, are inherently spatial as they reconfigure the meaning and the practice of the public and the private, and the multiple scales for embodying and exercising power. Our research design relied on a mixed method qualitative approach that combines open-ended interviews, structured questionnaires, focus group discussions, and collective mapping. Individual mapping as well, document analysis, and archival research. Our research participants consisted of residents along the Mexico-U.S. border who are involved in community and civic organizations, also many academics, that address issues related to our study topics, government officials in strategic positions, as well as people who have been particularly affected by the kinds of topics we are studying. And I have a bit about how we are thinking about experts, the production of knowledge, many of the topics that have come up here. What is it that constitutes knowledge, and how did we choose the experts for our study? Given our research topic, an interview with Lezaola was an uncontroversial decision. In fact, and I can talk with you also about IRB, and how this process. By the time of our appointment in May 2012, we had already conducted many months of fieldwork in Juarez and El Paso, and we turned our focus to government agents in Ciudad Juarez and in the state capital of Chihuahua City to discuss the transition back to civilian municipal governance after years of military federal police patrolling the border cities. At one point, the municipal government of Juarez had been given over to a general during this war. Lezola had been hired in 2011 by the newly elected mayor of a troubled Juarez 5 years after the then Mexican president Felipe Calderon had declared war against the country's organized crime syndicates, commonly referred to as cartels. In the ensuing 6 years, over 120,000 Mexicans would perish in this war, with many more adding to the ranks of the disappeared and injured, up to about 30,000 who had been forcibly disappeared by the government. By 2009, Juarez would come to expose some of the worst elements of this war, with thousands assassinated, another untold number forcibly disappeared by state agents or those protected by them, along with soaring rates of extortion and kidnapping. These numbers established the city's ignominious status as the murder capital of the world in 2012, places keeping such statistics. Lezola was no stranger to such events. In his previous job, his previous job had been as the controversial police chief in Tijuana, in Baja California. Some accredited him with unusual bravery as he led the government's charge in that violent border city against organized crime and illegal drug trade. Others, including Human Rights Watch, claim that he not only allowed torture and other human rights abuses to flourish under his watch, but that he also directly participated in torture, including the use of electric shocks, rape, and near suffocation of detainees. 3 years later, and after his 2-year tenure as police chief in Juarez had ended in 2013, he was banned from serving in the Tijuana police forces for 8 years as a result of these torture allegations. There had been a court case. And new accusations of torture and police abuse emerged out of his tenure in Juarez. Shortly after he began his Juarez job, police forces under his watch were publicly accused of participating in the forced disappearances of many Mexican citizens who were presumed to be dead by the time of our interview. Also within a month of his arrival, Lezola received more death threats against himself. A banner was unfurled from the city bridge that promised a dead police officer for each day that Lezola served on the force, and several officers were assassinated along with dozens of civilians. In 2015, Lezola almost succumbed to the promised assassination when a hitman gunned him down in Juarez. The attempt left him paralyzed from the waist down. His 2-year-old son, who was seated in the backseat of the car, survived. And Lezola has now run for mayor of Tijuana, a city in which he cannot legally serve as police chief, but he can be their boss. But he didn't win the election, but he's going to go. He says he's going again. At the time we initiated our project in fall 2010, the border region had experienced notable changes in its municipal policing and urban governance, and the word militarization was increasingly used. I'm skip that to get to some things I want to say. Okay, so our interview. Okay, let me get this. So in 2011, Lezola's task was, as I said, to return the policing to a municipal form of governance, and bring it back to the municipality because the city had been policed by federal police forces and the Army. The Army and the federal police forces were still there, but he was bringing it back into municipal control, which of course is part of a civilian government approach. His approach to this task, he publicly explained, was as a former military man himself, who sought to professionalize the forces by adopting certain military tactics for securing the city, rooting out internal corruption, and restoring public order. However, our interview with Lezola raises many ethical questions, even though he was somebody whom we needed to interview, right, as part of this kind of study. Raises many ethical questions that form the kernel of the discussion in this paper that I'm contemplating. Since he's known or charged and found to be guilty of conducting torture, there are many questions that we asked ourselves. So what does it mean to produce knowledge about human societies based on interviews with people found guilty of perpetrating crimes against humanity? Okay? How do we contextualize the knowledge gained from mining the expertise of those whose expertise derives from their experience as agents of state terror? Is knowledge of state terror only possible by collecting data from those who terrorize? What is the role of the researcher in turning this data into public knowledge? So I don't have much time to read more, but really the question is, how do we think of the ethics of making terror understandable, of understanding terror? And I get into, in the interview with him, I don't know if I have a little bit of time left, I guess.
You have more than 6 minutes.
Oh, good. in the interview with him, I'm going to just read some of this. It's some that's out of the transcript, and to give you a sense of some of the things we're thinking about. But really, this question of what does it mean to make terror understandable, okay? And to understand the perspective, of those who terrorize. Now, and I will say, we are all very aware of our complex relationships with this, okay? Our different citizenships, our different fundings from our government agents. We're thinking about that as well. Okay, so this is our date of the interview setting. Once we confirmed our appointment with the guard in the public parking lot next to the municipal headquarters, we then proceeded into the heavily fortified building, presented ourselves at the front door, and passed through metal detectors. So this is the police station, so it's a very fortified facility. About 10 minutes after being seated by Les Ola's secretary in the reception area, 2 heavily armed police officers carrying long rifles and wearing bulletproof vests burst into the waiting room and looked intently at the 3 of us. They then stepped aside as Les Ola emerged from between them. "Good morning," he said to us, "come with me." We stood and followed him into an office dominated by a large wooden desk with a desktop computer. Juanita and I sat first, knowing that none of the men would sit before us. In the 2 chairs he indicated, he unholstered his pistol from his waist, along with the gun he carried near his ankle, and he placed them behind him. The interview started with an introduction of the research team and of the project. We explained our protocols. Did that say 0 or 1 or 5? 5. Okay, I can't see it. And since we were interviewing a public official, we actually didn't need to go through a lot of that because he was doing his job and we were doing our job. But we did have, our informed consent form, and I can talk with you about all of that stuff and how it works. Les Ola is a very practiced interview giver as part of his job, but he also had given high-profile interviews. He'd been featured in the New Yorker magazine, high-profile interviews in the New York Times, The Guardian, and so forth. He knew what he was doing. So he was doing his job, we were doing ours. We pulled out our tape recorders, our notebooks, and our pens, and we all got going, right? In response to our first question, asking if he regarded the violence in Juarez as an outgrowth of the government's drug war, Les Ola explained that as a military man, he opposed the language of war as it gave the delinquents, his preferred term, in addition to cockroaches, which I consider, a certain kind of legitimacy. They were delinquents, he specified. He did, however, approve of military tactics and concepts for policing these delinquents, who, he clarified, are attacking the economy, the education, the culture, and all I didn't translate this in Spanish, so hang on. So all of the factors that operate in a conventional society. For this reason, he explained in response to a follow-up question regarding why the violence had worsened with the presence of the military and federal police. He says the problems have their basis in civil society itself. So he had to root out the problems from within civil society. This gets to the idea of the internal enemy, okay? And so that there are criminal elements within society, and we have to extirpate those criminal elements. And then he later explained, when we asked him about the rough treatment and harassment of activists, he said the activists were creating problems because they were through their activities, actually protecting the